The summer of 1892 brought with it a heat that seemed to press down on the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, like a heavy woolen blanket that refused to be cast off. The sun beat relentlessly against the weathered wooden storefronts, causing the paint to peel and curl in thin, brittle strips that danced in the occasional hot breeze. Dust swirled in lazy spirals down the main street, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that settled into the creases of weathered faces and the folds of worn clothing. It was on such a day, when the heat shimmered off the packed earth like water, that she appeared at the edge of town. The first to notice her was old Pete Hawkins, who spent his days whittling on the porch of Murphy's General Store, his keen eyes scanning the horizon out of habit more than necessity. He squinted through the heat haze, his weathered hands stilling on his piece of pine wood as he watched the solitary figure approach. She moved with an unmistakable limp, her left leg dragging slightly with each step, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of determination rather than defeat. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, and her dress, once perhaps a cheerful blue calico, was now faded and torn at the hem, stained with the dust and mud of countless miles. A small carpet bag hung from her right hand, and across her back she carried what appeared to be a canvas satchel. "Well, I'll be," Pete muttered, leaning forward in his chair. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor." The sound of his voice carried in the still air, and soon other townspeople began to emerge from their shops and homes, drawn by curiosity and the rare sight of a stranger on foot. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, appeared in the doorway of the church, her hand shading her eyes as she peered down the street. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, stepped out of his forge, his leather apron dark with sweat and soot. As the young woman drew closer, the details of her appearance became clearer, and with them the whispers began. She was perhaps 25 years old, with skin that had been bronzed by sun and wind, and eyes that held a weariness that seemed far older than her years. Her left leg, they could see now, was indeed damaged. Whether from injury or birth, none could say, but she carried herself with a dignity that made some of the observers shift uncomfortably. "Poor thing," Mrs. Henderson whispered to her neighbor, Mrs. Cooper. "Look at the state of her." "Wonder where she's come from," Mrs. Cooper replied, her voice carrying the mixture of pity and curiosity that often accompanied such observations. "And where she's headed." The young woman seemed oblivious to the stares and whispers that followed her progress down the main street. Her eyes swept the buildings with a careful assessment, taking in the saloon, the general store, the hotel, and the small diner that served as the town's gathering place. When her gaze fell upon the hotel, she paused for a moment, as if considering, then continued her steady approach. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's physician, emerged from his office just as she passed. A man of middle years with kind eyes and graying temples, he had seen his share of suffering and recognized it in others. There was something about the way she carried herself, the careful placement of each step, the slight tightening around her eyes with each movement, that spoke to his professional instincts. "Miss," he called out gently, stepping into the street, "are you in need of assistance?" She turned toward him, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. Despite the exhaustion and the layer of dust that covered her, there was a striking beauty there. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes the color of sage that held both wariness and intelligence. When she spoke, her voice was low and measured, with an accent that spoke of education despite her current circumstances. "I'm looking for work," she said simply, "and perhaps a place to stay the night." Dr. Morrison nodded, his expression thoughtful. "There's the hotel." He gestured toward the two-story building with its painted sign creaking in the breeze. "Mrs. Palmer runs it. She's fair, though she might ask questions." "I don't mind questions," the young woman replied, though something in her tone suggested she might not answer all of them. As she made her way toward the hotel, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but the whispers continued. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the arrival of a stranger was always cause for speculation, and a young woman traveling alone with an obvious disability was particularly intriguing. "She's got backbone, I'll give her that," Pete Hawkins observed to anyone within earshot. "Takes grit to walk into a strange town like that. Takes desperation too," added Martha Collins, who ran the town's small restaurant. "Question is, what's she running from?" The hotel's front door stood open in a futile attempt to catch any breeze that might provide relief from the heat. The lobby was small and sparsely furnished, with a worn carpet that had once been red and a registration desk that bore the scars of years of use. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her dress neat, but showing the careful mending that spoke of thrift rather than poverty. "Mrs. Palmer?" the young woman asked, approaching the desk. "That's right," the older woman replied, looking up from her ledger. Her eyes took in the stranger's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had run a hotel for 20 years. "You're looking for a room?" "Yes, ma'am. Just for tonight to start with." Mrs. Palmer quoted a price that was fair by frontier standards, and the young woman reached into her carpet bag to produce the exact amount. As she signed the register, Mrs. Palmer couldn't help but notice the careful formation of the letters, the educated hand that wrote Sarah Mitchell in clear, flowing script. "Sarah Mitchell," Mrs. Palmer read aloud. "That's a pretty name. You've come a long way by the look of it." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, offering no elaboration. Mrs. Palmer handed her a key attached to a wooden tag. "Room 7, top of the stairs. There's a wash basin and pitcher up there, and if you need anything else, just let me know. Supper's served at the restaurant next door until 8 o'clock. Sarah nodded her thanks and made her way up the narrow staircase, her limp more pronounced now that the day's walk had taken its toll. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a faded quilt, a simple wooden chair and a window that looked out over the town's main street. She set her carpetbag on the chair and walked to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to look down at the street below. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows between the buildings, and the heat was starting to ease slightly. From her vantage point, she could see the people of Cedar Ridge going about their daily business. The blacksmith shoeing a horse, women hanging laundry behind their homes, children playing in the dust despite the heat. It was then that she noticed him. He sat on horseback at the edge of town, motionless as a statue, his dark eyes fixed on the hotel. Even from a distance, there was something about him that set him apart from the other men she had observed. His long black hair was braided and adorned with what appeared to be feathers, and his clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and more modern elements. He sat his horse with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle, and there was something in his bearing that commanded respect. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward her window. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah felt something stir within her chest. A recognition of some kind, though she was certain she had never seen him before. Then, with a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or simple courtesy, he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the growing shadows of evening. Sarah let the curtain fall back into place and sank onto the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. The events of the past weeks, the long journey, the uncertainty, the constant fear of discovery had taken their toll. But she had made it this far, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and, she hoped, new opportunities. Outside her window, the town of Cedar Ridge settled into the rhythm of evening. The heat began to ease, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, she could hear the sound of a harmonica playing a lonely melody, and somewhere, a dog barked once, and then fell silent. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring. She had work to find, a new life to build, and a past to leave behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in her heart. The night deepened around Cedar Ridge, and with it came the promise of change, for the town, for its people, and for the young woman who had limped into their midst, carrying secrets and dreams in equal measure. The morning sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the dusty main street as Sarah Mitchell made her way down the hotel's narrow staircase. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragments of memory and the dark eyes of the horseman she had glimpsed from her window. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and she was conscious of the way her left leg dragged slightly, more noticeable in the morning stiffness that always accompanied her first steps of the day. Mrs. Palmer was already at her post behind the registration desk, her graying hair neatly arranged and her dress crisp despite the early hour. She looked up as Sarah approached, offering a smile that was both welcoming and curious. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell. I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," Sarah replied, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. "I was wondering if you might know of any work available in town. I'm willing to do most anything honest." Mrs. Palmer's expression softened with sympathy. "Work can be scarce around here, especially for—" She paused, seeming to search for diplomatic words. "Well, for a young lady on her own, what kind of work did you do before?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, her fingers unconsciously tightening on the handle of her carpetbag. "I was a teacher," she said finally. "I taught at a school back east." "A teacher?" Mrs. Palmer's eyes lit up with interest. Well, now that's something. Our school mom, Miss Peterson, left just last month to get married. Went off to San Francisco with her new husband. The school board's been looking for a replacement, though I'll be honest with you, the pay isn't much and some of the families can be particular about who they want teaching their children. Sarah's heart lifted at the possibility, even as she understood the delicate way Mrs. Palmer was trying to warn her about potential prejudice. I would be very interested in speaking with the school board. I have letters of recommendation, and I'm qualified to teach all subjects through the 8th grade. The chairman of the school board is Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore. He owns the largest ranch outside of town and carries considerable influence around here. He's not an unkind man, but he's traditional in his thinking. You might want to speak with him this morning before word gets around too much about your being here. Sarah nodded, understanding the implicit advice. In small towns, news traveled fast, and first impressions could be lasting. Where might I find Mr. Whitmore? He usually comes to town on Tuesdays and Fridays for supplies. Today being Friday, you'll likely find him at Murphy's General Store around 10 o'clock. He's a tall man with silver hair and a mustache, always wears a black hat with a silver band. After thanking Mrs. Palmer for her kindness, Sarah made her way to the small restaurant next door for breakfast. The establishment was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. Several patrons looked up as she entered, their conversations pausing momentarily before resuming in lower tones. Martha Collins, the proprietor, emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman of generous proportions, with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair that she wore in a practical bun. You must be the young lady staying at the hotel. I'm Martha Collins. Welcome to Cedar Ridge. Thank you, Mrs. Collins. I'm Sarah Mitchell. Please sit anywhere you like. Coffee's fresh and I've got eggs, bacon and biscuits if you're hungry. Sarah chose a table near the window where she could observe the street while she ate. The food was simple but good, and the coffee was strong and hot. As she ate, she became aware of the conversations around her, though the speakers made efforts to keep their voices low. Shame about her leg, she heard one woman whisper to her companion. Pretty enough girl otherwise. Wonder what happened to her, came the reply. Accident, you think, or born that way? Does it matter? She's got a hard road ahead of her either way. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though the words stung. She had grown accustomed to such conversations over the years, but they never failed to remind her of how others perceived her. She finished her breakfast in silence, paid Martha Collins and stepped back onto the street. The morning was already growing warm, and she could see the heat beginning to shimmer off the packed earth. She had some time before Mr. Whitmore was expected at the general store, so she decided to explore the town and get a better sense of the place she hoped to make her new home. Cedar Ridge was larger than it had appeared from her hotel window, with several side streets branching off from the main thoroughfare. She passed a small church with a white steeple, a barber shop, and a millinery store with faded ribbons and hats displayed in the window. The buildings were a mixture of wood and stone, some painted and others weathered grey by the elements. At the edge of town, she found the schoolhouse, a simple wooden structure with windows on 3 sides and a bell tower on the roof. The building was empty now, but she could imagine it filled with children's voices and the scratch of chalk on slate. She walked around the perimeter, noting the small playground area with its swings and the well that provided water for the students. Thinking of teaching there? The voice startled her, and she turned to see a man approaching from the direction of town. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying temples, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers. She recognized him as the doctor who had spoken to her the previous day. "Dr. Morrison," she said, offering a slight smile. "Yes, I was hoping to speak with the school board about the position." "Samuel Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell." She shook his hand, noting the gentleness of his grip and the way his eyes assessed her with professional interest. "I couldn't help but notice yesterday that you favor your left leg. Are you in pain?" The directness of his question surprised her, though she appreciated his straightforward manner. "Some days more than others. It's an old injury that didn't heal properly. I don't mean to pry, but if you're planning to stay in Cedar Ridge, you should know that I'm available if you need medical attention. I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've seen all manner of ailments and injuries." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. That's very kind." He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Miss Mitchell, this town can be slow to accept newcomers, especially those who are different in any way. But we need good people, and from what I observed yesterday, you seem to have strength of character. Don't let the whispers discourage you." His words were more encouraging than he might have realized, and Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. I appreciate that, Dr. Morrison. I'm not easily discouraged. Good. The children here deserve a qualified teacher, and from what Mrs. Palmer tells me, you have the credentials. The school board meets informally at Murphy's store most Friday mornings. If you're planning to speak with them, I'd suggest doing so sooner rather than later. After Dr. Morrison continued on his way, Sarah made her way back toward the center of town. The morning was progressing, and she could see more people beginning to emerge from their homes and businesses. She paused outside Murphy's general store, gathering her courage and checking her appearance in the reflection of the window. The store was busy when she entered, with several customers browsing the shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The air was filled with the scents of leather, coffee, and the various goods that crowded the space. Behind the counter, a man with thinning hair and spectacles was measuring out flour for a customer. "Mr. Murphy?" she asked, approaching the counter. "That's right, miss. What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore. I was told he might be here this morning." Murphy glanced toward the back of the store, where several men had gathered around a table covered with papers and coffee cups. "He's back there with the other board members. They're discussing school business, as a matter of fact. You might want to wait a minute. They don't like being interrupted when they're talking important matters." Sarah nodded and positioned herself where she could observe the group without being too obvious. She could see a tall man with silver hair and a mustache, wearing a black hat with a distinctive silver band. Clearly, Mr. Whitmore. The other men appeared to be local businessmen, their conversation animated but kept at a level that prevented her from overhearing the details. As she waited, she became aware of other customers in the store watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and speculation. She kept her expression pleasant but neutral, her hands folded in front of her as she stood patiently near the counter. "That's her," she heard one woman whisper to another, "the one who came in yesterday with the limp." "Poor thing," came the reply. "What do you suppose she wants with the school board? Maybe she's looking for work, though I can't imagine what kind of work she'd be suited for." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only made things worse. Instead, she focused on the conversation at the back of the store, waiting for an appropriate moment to introduce herself. The discussion among the board members seemed to be coming to a conclusion, and she saw Mr. Whitmore push back his chair and shake hands with the other men. This was her opportunity. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said, approaching the table as the group began to disperse. He turned toward her, his eyes taking in her appearance with a neutral expression. "Yes, miss, what can I do for you?" "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I understand you're looking for a new school teacher, and I'd like to apply for the position." The store seemed to fall silent around them, and Sarah was acutely aware of the eyes upon her. Mr. Whitmore's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the assessment in his gaze as he took in her appearance and her obvious disability. "I see," he said finally. "Do you have teaching experience, Miss Mitchell?" "Yes, sir. I taught for 3 years at the Riverside Academy in Pennsylvania. I have letters of recommendation and certificates showing my qualifications." Mr. Whitmore glanced at the other board members, who had paused in their departure to listen to the conversation. "Teaching is demanding work, Miss Mitchell. It requires someone who can handle energetic children, maintain discipline, and, well, command respect." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a familiar flash of determination. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Whitmore, but I believe my qualifications speak for themselves. I'm willing to demonstrate my abilities if you'd like to arrange a trial period." "The position doesn't pay much," he said, his tone suggesting he was trying to discourage her. $20 a month and you'd have to find your own lodging." "That would be acceptable," Sarah replied without hesitation. Mr. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Mitchell. Bring your recommendations to my ranch tomorrow morning. We'll discuss the matter further then." As Sarah left the store, she could feel the weight of many eyes upon her back and hear the immediate buzz of conversation that followed her departure. She had taken the first step, but she knew the real challenge was still ahead. The Whitmore Ranch lay 5 miles outside Cedar Ridge, nestled in a valley where the grassland rolled like a green sea toward the distant mountains. Sarah had risen before dawn to make the journey on foot, her carpet bag containing her precious letters of recommendation clutched tightly in her hand. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The ranch house was impressive by frontier standards, a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Cattle grazed in the nearby pastures, and she could see several outbuildings, including a large barn, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a blacksmith shop. The sound of hammering echoed across the yard, and she could smell the familiar scent of horses and leather. As she approached the main house, a woman emerged from the front door. She was perhaps 40 years old, with auburn hair streaked with silver, and wearing a practical dress of dark blue calico. Her bearing suggested she was accustomed to managing both household and ranch business with equal competence. "You must be Miss Mitchell," the woman said, offering a welcoming smile. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore. Nathaniel told me you'd be coming by this morning." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you for seeing me. Please come in. Nathaniel's in his study looking over some papers. Can I offer you some coffee? You've had quite a walk." Sarah accepted gratefully, and Mrs. Whitmore led her through a comfortably furnished parlor to a sunny kitchen where the smell of fresh bread filled the air. As she poured coffee from a blue enamel pot, Mrs. Whitmore studied Sarah with the frank assessment of a woman accustomed to judging character. "Nathaniel mentioned you were a teacher back east," she said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "That must have been quite a change coming out to a place like this." "It was," Sarah admitted, "but sometimes change is necessary." Mrs. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose it is. I came out here from Boston 23 years ago to marry Nathaniel. People thought I was mad, leaving civilization for the frontier, but I've never regretted it. This land has a way of getting into your blood." Before Sarah could respond, heavy footsteps echoed through the house and Mr. Whitmore appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed in work clothes rather than the business attire he had worn in town, and his silver hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. "Miss Mitchell," he said with a nod, "I trust you found the ranch without difficulty." "Yes, sir, your directions were very clear." "Good. Shall we get down to business then? I have men waiting to discuss the fall roundup, so I'd like to settle this matter quickly." Mrs. Whitmore shot her husband a look that suggested his bluntness was not entirely appreciated, but Sarah appreciated his directness. She opened her carpet bag and withdrew a small portfolio containing her credentials. "These are my letters of recommendation from the Riverside Academy," she said, placing them on the table. "As you can see, I taught there for 3 years and received commendations for my work with students of all ages." Mr. Whitmore picked up the first letter and began to read, his expression neutral. Sarah watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of his thoughts, but his years of business dealings had taught him to keep his reactions hidden. "This speaks highly of your abilities," he said finally. "But Miss Mitchell, I have to be frank with you. Teaching in a frontier school is very different from teaching in an established academy back east. The children here are rough around the edges. Many of them have responsibilities at home that take precedence over their education, and frankly, maintaining discipline can be challenging even for someone in full health." Sarah felt her cheeks flush at the implication, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand your concerns, but I believe you're underestimating both my abilities and the children's capacity to learn. I've dealt with difficult students before, and I found that respect is earned through competence and fairness, not through physical intimidation." "That's a pretty speech," he replied, not unkindly. "But can you handle a classroom full of frontier children? Some of them are nearly as big as you are, and they're not always inclined to listen to authority." "Why don't you let her prove herself?" Mrs. Whitmore interjected. "The children need a teacher, and Miss Mitchell is clearly qualified. What harm would there be in giving her a chance?" Mr. Whitmore looked at his wife, and Sarah could see the long-married couple's ability to communicate without words. Finally, he sighed and turned back to Sarah. "Very well, I'll offer you a trial period of 1 month. If you can handle the children and maintain order in the classroom, the position is yours. But if there are problems, if parents complain or if discipline becomes an issue, you'll be dismissed immediately. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Sarah replied, relief flooding through her. "When would you like me to start?" "Monday morning. School begins at 8 o'clock sharp. You'll have 23 students, ages 6 through 14. The older boys only attend when they are not needed for ranch work, especially during harvest season." After finalizing the details of her employment, Sarah prepared to leave for the walk back to town. Mrs. Whitmore insisted on packing her a lunch and filled a canteen with fresh water from the well. "Don't let Nathaniel's gruffness discourage you," she said quietly as they stood on the porch. "He's a good man, but he's worried about the school's reputation. We've had problems with teachers before. Some left after only a few weeks, unable to handle the challenges, but I have a feeling you're made of sterner stuff." "I hope so, Mrs. Whitmore. I truly do. The walk back to town gave Sarah time to think about the challenges ahead. She had won the position, but she knew the real test would come when she faced her first classroom of frontier children. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice the rider approaching until he was nearly upon her. It was the same man she had seen from her hotel window, the Lakota warrior who had watched her arrival in town. Up close, she could see the details that distance had obscured. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and decorated with eagle feathers, and he wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and modern clothing that spoke of someone who moved between two worlds. He brought his horse to a stop beside her and dismounted with fluid grace. For a moment they stood facing each other in the middle of the dusty road, neither speaking. Sarah felt her heart beating faster, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. "You are the new teacher," he said finally. His voice was deep and measured, and his English was perfect, with only the slightest accent to suggest it was not his first language. "Yes," Sarah replied, finding her voice. "I am. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am called Joseph Running Bear by the white men. My people know me as Matoska, White Bear." He paused, studying her with those dark eyes. "You walk far in the heat. Your leg pains you." Sarah was surprised by his directness, though she found it less offensive than pitying. "It's manageable," she said. "The walk helps strengthen it." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. The healing of the body requires patience and determination, like the healing of the spirit. "Are you a medicine man?" she asked, curious about this man who seemed to see more than others. "I am many things. I have walked the path of the warrior, and I have learned the ways of the white man's world. I work sometimes for the Indian agent, helping to keep peace between our peoples. But yes, I have also learned the healing ways of my grandfather." "That must be difficult. Moving between two worlds, I mean." Joseph's expression grew thoughtful. "All life is difficult, Miss Mitchell. The question is whether we choose to grow stronger from our challenges or allow them to break us." His gaze dropped briefly to her leg, then back to her eyes. "You have chosen strength." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "You speak as if you know something about challenges." "I was not born to this life of riding between worlds," he said simply. "I was taken from my people as a child, sent to a government school where they tried to make me forget who I was. I learned their language, their ways, their beliefs, but I never forgot my own people or my own heart." Sarah felt a stirring of understanding. Here was someone else who knew what it was like to be different, to face a world that saw you as somehow less than whole. That must have been terrifying for a child. "Yes, but it also taught me that strength comes from within, not from what others see when they look at you." He paused, then added, "The children you will teach, some of them carry their own burdens. They will test you, not because they are bad, but because they need to know if you are strong enough to help them." "And what do you think?" Sarah asked. "Am I strong enough?" Joseph studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look into her very soul. "I think you are stronger than you know, Sarah Mitchell, but strength without wisdom can be dangerous. The children will sense your fear and your doubts. They will also sense your courage and your compassion. Which do you choose to show them?" Without waiting for an answer, he mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "I will be watching to see how you fare with your new students. This town has need of someone who understands that different does not mean broken." As he rode away, Sarah stood in the dusty road watching until he disappeared over a rise. His words echoed in her mind, and she realized that he had given her something precious, the validation that she was not alone in her struggles, and the challenge to prove herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. The sun was beginning to set as she finally reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, mixed with the strange comfort of knowing that somewhere in this vast territory there was at least one person who understood what it meant to be different and still choose to stand strong. Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill that promised the changing of seasons. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with lesson plans and worries about the day ahead. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a dark green wool that had seen better days but was clean and mended, and pinned her hair back in a severe bun that she hoped would lend her an air of authority. The walk to the schoolhouse took 20 minutes, and she arrived early to prepare the classroom. The building was smaller than she had expected, with rough-hewn wooden walls and windows that let in the morning light. 23 desks of various sizes were arranged in rows, some clearly handmade by fathers for their children. A large slate blackboard dominated the front wall, and a pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, unlit but ready for the cold months ahead. Sarah arranged her few supplies on the teacher's desk, a worn wooden lectern that had clearly seen years of use, and wrote her name on the blackboard in neat, cursive letters. She had just finished when she heard the first sounds of approaching children, voices calling to each other, the creak of wagon wheels and the thud of boots on wooden steps. The door burst open, and her first student entered, a boy of perhaps 10 with sandy hair and freckles, wearing patched overalls and carrying a slate. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes immediately going to her leg as she moved from behind the desk. "You're the new teacher?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Yes, I am. Miss Mitchell. And you are?" "Tommy Wilson," he replied, still staring. "My pa said you were different." Before Sarah could respond, more children began filing in. She watched them carefully, noting the way their eyes assessed her, the whispered conversations, the way some of them glanced at her leg and then looked away quickly. These were frontier children, she realized, accustomed to hardship and quick to judge whether someone was strong enough to earn their respect. The oldest student was a boy who looked to be about 14, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. He took a seat in the back row and fixed her with a challenging stare that seemed to say he would not be easily impressed. Several girls of various ages clustered together, their dresses simple but clean, their hair braided or pinned back practically. "Good morning, children," Sarah said, moving to stand in front of the blackboard. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on her. "My name is Miss Mitchell, and I will be your teacher. I know you're curious about me, so let me tell you a little about myself. I come from Pennsylvania, where I taught at a school much like this one. I'm here because I believe education is the most important gift we can give ourselves and our communities." A hand shot up in the middle of the room. "Yes?" Sarah said, nodding to a girl of about 12 with dark hair and serious eyes. "Miss Mitchell, my name is Mary Patterson. Are you going to be able to keep up with us?" Some of the boys can be pretty rough. Sarah appreciated the girl's directness. "That's a fair question, Mary. I won't lie to you. I do have some physical limitations, but I've found that a good teacher doesn't need to chase down misbehaving students. A good teacher earns respect through fairness, knowledge, and genuine care for her students' success." The big boy in the back row snorted. "That's a pretty speech, but what happens when someone don't want to listen?" "And you are?" Sarah asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "Jake Morrison. My pa's the doc." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I've seen plenty of teachers come and go. Most of them can't handle us." "I see. Well, Jake, I appreciate your honesty. Why don't we start with something simple? Can you tell me what you learned in arithmetic last year?" "Don't see why I should," he replied with a shrug. "I can count money and measure feed. That's all the arithmetic I need." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's practical knowledge, certainly. But what if I told you that understanding mathematics could help you calculate how much profit your father makes from his practice, or help you figure out the best way to invest money for your future?" Jake's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of interest. "How do you mean?" "Well, if your father charges $3 for a house call and makes an average of 5 calls per day, how much does he earn in a week? And if he has expenses of $10 per week for supplies and medicines, what's his actual profit?" She could see Jake working through the problem in his head, his competitive nature engaged despite his initial resistance. "That's $15 a day times 7 days, $105, minus 10 for expenses, $95 profit. Excellent. You see, mathematics isn't just about abstract numbers. It's about understanding the world around us and making informed decisions." Sarah turned to address the entire class. "Now, I know some of you are wondering whether I can maintain discipline in this classroom. Let me be clear. I expect respect, attention, and effort from each of you. In return, I promise to treat you with fairness, to challenge you to learn and grow, and to never give up on any of you." The morning progressed better than Sarah had dared hope. She divided the students into groups by age and ability, assigning reading exercises to the younger children while working with the older students on more advanced subjects. She found that many of them were brighter than their previous educational experiences had allowed them to demonstrate. However, her first real test came just before the lunch break. 2 of the older boys, Jake Morrison and another student named Pete Hawkins, grandson of the old man who whittled on the store porch, began a whispered argument that gradually grew louder. "I said that's my pencil," Pete hissed, reaching across the aisle to grab it from Jake's desk. "You're a liar," Jake shot back, holding the pencil away from Pete's reach. I brought this from home. Boys, Sarah said firmly, please settle your dispute quietly. But the argument escalated with Pete standing up and lunging for the pencil. Jake pushed him back, and suddenly both boys were on their feet, fists raised. The entire classroom erupted in excited chatter as the other students turned to watch the confrontation. Sarah knew this was the moment that would define her tenure at the school. She couldn't physically separate two boys who were nearly as large as she was, but she had to establish her authority. Drawing on her experience with difficult students, she walked calmly to the front of the room and picked up the metal ruler from her desk. Crack! The sound of the ruler striking the blackboard echoed through the room like a gunshot, and every student froze. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "you will return to your seats immediately." The tone of absolute authority in her voice seemed to surprise the boys as much as it did the other students. Jake and Pete looked at each other, then back at Sarah, uncertainty replacing their anger. "Now," she continued, "the pencil will remain on my desk until the end of the day. At that time, whichever one of you can provide proof of ownership may claim it. The other will receive a new pencil from the school supplies. Is that understood?" Both boys nodded and returned to their seats, the fight gone out of them. Sarah could see the other students looking at her with new respect, and she felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. "Now then," she said, returning to her lesson as if nothing had happened, "let's continue with our geography lesson. Who can tell me the name of the mountain range we can see from our classroom window?" The afternoon passed more smoothly, though Sarah was constantly aware of being watched and tested. The younger children seemed to accept her more readily, while the older students remained somewhat skeptical, but no longer openly challenging. As the school day ended and the children began to file out, Mary Patterson approached her desk. "Miss Mitchell, I wanted to say, that was pretty clever the way you handled Jake and Pete." "Thank you, Mary. I hope you understand that I'm not here to fight with anyone. I'm here to teach." "Yes, ma'am. I think some of the others are starting to understand that too." After the last student had left, Sarah sat at her desk for a few minutes reflecting on the day. It had been challenging, but not impossible. She had established her authority without resorting to physical intimidation, and she had engaged the students' minds in ways that seemed to surprise them. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed a figure standing in the doorway. It was Joseph Running Bear, though she hadn't heard him approach. He leaned against the doorframe, his dark eyes taking in the classroom and her. "How did it go?" he asked simply. "Better than I expected," Sarah replied honestly. "They tested me, but I think I passed." "Good. I watched from the ridge for a while this morning. I saw the parents gathering to see if you would survive your first day." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "They were watching?" "Some of them. This is a small community, Miss Mitchell. What happens in the schoolhouse matters to everyone. They needed to see that you could handle their children." "And what did they see?" Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "They saw a teacher who understands that respect must be earned, not demanded. They saw someone who treats their children as individuals worth educating, not just problems to be controlled." As they walked together toward town, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in months. The day had been difficult, but she had met its challenges head-on. More importantly, she had begun to earn the respect of her students, and perhaps the community. "Tomorrow will be easier," Joseph said as they reached the edge of town. "How can you be sure?" "Because today you proved you belong here. Tomorrow you can focus on teaching instead of surviving." As Sarah watched him ride away into the gathering twilight, she realized he was right. She had passed her first test, but more importantly, she had begun to find her place in this frontier community. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she was no longer walking it alone. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's first day at the Cedar Ridge School, and the rhythm of frontier life had begun to settle around her like a familiar cloak. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the mountains in the distance were already dusted with early snow. Each morning brought new challenges and small victories, and Sarah found herself looking forward to the walk to the schoolhouse with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Her students had begun to accept her in ways that went beyond mere tolerance. Jake Morrison, the doctor's son who had challenged her that first day, had become one of her most dedicated pupils, especially in mathematics. Mary Patterson had revealed herself to be a gifted reader with a hunger for knowledge that reminded Sarah of her own younger self. Even the youngest children, initially shy and uncertain, now greeted her with genuine smiles and eager questions. It was on a crisp Thursday morning that Sarah's carefully constructed new life faced its first real threat. She was teaching a lesson on American geography when the schoolhouse door opened unexpectedly. Mr. Whitmore entered, his expression grave, followed by two other men Sarah didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of formal attire that suggested they were from somewhere far from the frontier. "Children," Sarah said, maintaining her composure despite the knot of anxiety forming in her stomach, "please continue reading Chapter 5 in your geography books. I'll be back in a moment." She stepped outside with the three men, closing the door behind her to give them privacy. The crisp air made her breath visible in small puffs, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Miss Mitchell," Mr. Whitmore began, his tone carefully neutral, "these gentlemen are from the Territorial Education Board. They've come to observe your teaching methods." The taller of the two strangers, a man with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Superintendent Davies, and this is Inspector Walsh. We've received some concerns about your appointment to this position." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of concerns, Mr. Davies?" "Questions about your qualifications, your ability to maintain proper discipline, and—" He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her leg. "Your physical capacity to fulfill the demands of the position." "I see. And who raised these concerns?" Inspector Walsh, a younger man with a thin mustache and an officious air, consulted a notebook. "We received a formal complaint from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, who has a daughter in your class. She alleges that you are unable to properly supervise the children during recess and that your condition makes you unsuitable as a role model for impressionable young minds." Sarah felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to remain calm. Mrs. Thornton was a woman she had encountered only twice, once at the general store and once when she had come to collect her daughter early from school. On both occasions, the woman had made her disapproval clear through cold stares and whispered comments to other parents. "I understand Mrs. Thornton's concerns," Sarah said carefully, "but I believe my teaching record speaks for itself. Perhaps you would like to observe my classroom before making any judgments." Superintendent Davies nodded. "That's precisely why we're here. We'll be observing your classes today and tomorrow. Inspector Walsh will also be conducting interviews with some of the parents and students." The observation began immediately. Sarah returned to her classroom with the three men, acutely aware of their presence as she attempted to continue her lesson. The children, sensing the tension, were unusually quiet and well-behaved. She could see Jake Morrison shooting worried glances at the observers, while Mary Patterson sat rigidly upright, her hands folded perfectly on her desk. Despite the pressure, Sarah found her stride. She guided the students through a mathematics lesson that built on practical applications, calculating the amount of grain needed to feed livestock through winter, determining the best prices for selling crops, and understanding basic interest rates for bank loans. The observers scribbled notes, their expressions unreadable. During the lunch break, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation between the two inspectors that made her blood run cold. Clearly intelligent and well-prepared, but the physical limitations, concern about setting precedent for other frontier schools, question of whether the community can truly respect. That afternoon, as she was conducting a reading lesson with the younger children, the schoolhouse door opened again. This time it was Joseph Running Bear who entered, though he remained near the back of the room, his presence both calming and protective. Inspector Walsh looked up from his notes with obvious disapproval. "I wasn't aware that Indians were permitted in the classroom." Sarah felt her temper flare. "Mr. Running Bear is a valued member of our community and a friend to the school. He has every right to be here." "I see." Walsh made another note, his disapproval evident. Joseph said nothing, but Sarah could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was struggling with his own anger. He remained standing quietly, his arms folded across his chest, watching the proceedings with the patience of a man accustomed to enduring indignities. The day seemed to drag on forever, but finally, the last student had been dismissed. As Sarah cleaned the blackboard and organized her desk, she could hear the three men talking in low voices outside the building. "Miss Mitchell," Superintendent Davies said, re-entering the classroom, "will be conducting our interviews tomorrow morning. I trust you'll make yourself available if we need to speak with you further." "Of course," Sarah replied, though she dreaded what those interviews might reveal. After the officials had left, Joseph approached her desk. "Are you all right?" Sarah sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know. They're looking for reasons to dismiss me, and I'm afraid they might find them. The children respect you. The parents who matter know you're a good teacher. But Mrs. Thornton's complaints, they might carry weight with people who've never met me." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then pulled up one of the student chairs and sat down across from her. "Tell me about Mrs. Thornton." Sarah sighed. "She's difficult. Her daughter Emma is a sweet child, but her mother seems to believe that my presence in the classroom is somehow harmful to the children. She's made several comments about how I'm not a proper role model, and she's convinced that I can't maintain order or protect the children if there's trouble." "And what do you think she's really afraid of?" The question caught Sarah off guard. I suppose she's afraid that having a teacher with a disability will somehow reflect poorly on the school or the community, perhaps. Or perhaps she's afraid that if the children see you overcoming your challenges, they might start to believe they can overcome their own. Sarah looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Thornton's daughter is not like the other children. She's quiet, struggles with her reading, and often seems lost during lessons. Perhaps her mother fears that if Emma sees you succeeding despite your differences, she might realize that being different isn't the same as being broken." The insight was both profound and troubling. Sarah had noticed that Emma seemed to struggle academically, but she had attributed it to shyness rather than any learning difficulties. "You think Mrs. Thornton is trying to protect her daughter from comparison. I think Mrs. Thornton is trying to protect herself from the possibility that her daughter's struggles might be addressed rather than hidden." That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room, staring out at the darkening street and thinking about Joseph's words. She had been so focused on her own challenges that she hadn't fully considered how her presence might affect others in unexpected ways. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the promise of the territory's first real snowfall in the air. Sarah arrived at the school early, hoping to prepare herself mentally for whatever the day might bring. She found several parents gathered outside the building, their expressions ranging from supportive to uncertain. Dr. Morrison approached her as she unlocked the schoolhouse door. "Miss Mitchell, I wanted you to know that several of us parents have spoken with the inspectors. Jake has told me how much his mathematics has improved under your instruction, and I've made sure the inspectors understand that." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. That means more than you know." "There's something else," he said quietly. "Mrs. Thornton has been vocal about her concerns, but I think you should know that she's not speaking for all of us. Many of the parents are quite pleased with your work." As the morning progressed, Sarah watched through the window as Inspector Walsh conducted his interviews. She saw him speaking with several parents, including Mrs. Thornton, who gestured animatedly as she spoke. But she also saw him talking with the Pattersons, the Wilsons, and other families whose children had thrived under her instruction. At lunchtime, Mary Patterson approached her desk with an unusual request. "Miss Mitchell, some of us students have been talking, and we were wondering, could we write a letter to those men? To tell them how we feel about having you as our teacher?" Sarah was touched by the gesture, but concerned about putting the children in the middle of an adult conflict. "That's very kind of you, Mary, but I don't want you children to feel like you have to defend me." "But we want to," Jake Morrison said, having overheard the conversation. "You're the first teacher who's ever made me actually want to learn mathematics, and you've never made any of us feel stupid for not knowing something." Other students began to gather around, nodding their agreement. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized how much these young people had come to mean to her, and how much she apparently meant to them. "All right," she said finally. "If you want to write letters, you may, but they must be honest and in your own words. Don't write what you think the inspectors want to hear. Write what you truly feel." The afternoon was spent with the students working on their letters, while Sarah conducted her regular lessons. She was amazed by the thoughtfulness and maturity of their writing, and by the genuine affection and respect they expressed for her. As the school day ended, Superintendent Davies approached her desk one final time. "Miss Mitchell will be making our decision tonight and announcing it tomorrow. I want you to know that this has been an enlightening experience." His tone was neutral, giving no hint of which way the decision might go. As Sarah walked back to the hotel that evening, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Tomorrow would determine whether she could continue building the life she had begun to create in Cedar Ridge, or whether she would once again be forced to start over somewhere new. The morning of the decision dawned clear and cold, with the first snow of the season dusting the rooftops of Cedar Ridge like powdered sugar. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the same green wool she had worn on her first day, and braided her hair in a simple style that she hoped conveyed both professionalism and confidence. The walk to the schoolhouse seemed longer than usual, each step echoing with the weight of uncertainty. As she approached the building, she was surprised to see a crowd gathered in the yard. Parents, students, and townspeople milled about in the crisp morning air, their breath visible in small clouds as they spoke in hushed tones. Dr. Morrison was the first to approach her. "Miss Mitchell, we wanted to be here when the decision is announced. Whatever happens, you should know that you have support in this community." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. That means everything to me." Mrs. Palmer from the hotel stepped forward, her face flushed with cold and determination. "I may not have children in your school, but I've seen how you carry yourself, how you treat people with respect. That says more about your character than any complaint ever could." More voices joined in, offering words of encouragement and support. Sarah was overwhelmed by the demonstration of community backing, but she also noticed the faces that were conspicuously absent: Mrs. Thornton and her allies, who had apparently chosen not to witness the outcome of their complaints. At precisely 9 o'clock, Superintendent Davies and Inspector Walsh emerged from the hotel where they had been staying. Both men wore serious expressions that revealed nothing of their decision. Mr. Whitmore accompanied them, his own face grave and unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Superintendent Davies announced, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "we have completed our investigation into the concerns raised about Miss Mitchell's appointment as teacher of the Cedar Ridge School." The crowd fell silent, the only sound the soft whisper of wind through the nearby pines and the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "We have interviewed parents, students, and community members," Davies continued. "We have observed classroom instruction and reviewed academic progress. We have also read the letters written by the students themselves, letters that demonstrate not only their academic growth, but also their genuine affection and respect for their teacher." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd before settling on Sarah. "However, we have also considered the concerns raised about Miss Mitchell's physical limitations and their potential impact on her ability to fulfill all aspects of the teaching position." Sarah's heart sank. This was it, the polite way of saying that her disability made her unsuitable for the role. She straightened her shoulders, preparing to face the disappointment with whatever dignity she could muster. "After careful consideration," Davies continued, "we have concluded that Miss Mitchell has not only met but exceeded the standards expected of a frontier schoolteacher. Her innovative teaching methods, her ability to connect with students of all ages and abilities, and her dedication to their academic and personal growth are exemplary." A murmur of surprise and relief rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt her knees go weak, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Furthermore," Inspector Walsh added, stepping forward, "we have observed that Miss Mitchell's personal challenges have not hindered her effectiveness as an educator. If anything, they have enhanced her ability to understand and support students who face their own difficulties. The academic progress we have documented in just 3 weeks is remarkable by any standard." Jake Morrison let out a whoop of joy that was quickly echoed by other students. Mary Patterson was crying openly, her face radiant with happiness. Dr. Morrison placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder as she struggled to process the news. "Therefore," Superintendent Davies concluded, "it is our recommendation that Miss Mitchell be confirmed as the permanent teacher of Cedar Ridge School, with full Territorial Education Board approval and support." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers, students hugging her waist, and parents shaking her hand. Through the celebration, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, Joseph Running Bear, watching the proceedings with a slight smile on his face. As the crowd began to disperse, people heading to their daily tasks with obvious relief and satisfaction, Joseph approached her. "Congratulations, Miss Mitchell, though I never doubted the outcome." "You didn't?" Sarah asked, still feeling overwhelmed by the morning's events. "I told you once that strength comes from within, not from what others see when they look at you. Today, they saw your strength clearly." Mr. Whitmore approached, extending his hand to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I had reservations about your appointment and I let those concerns color my judgment. You have proven yourself admirably." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I hope I can continue to serve the community well." "I have no doubt you will, and I want you to know that the school board has voted to increase your salary to $25 per month, effective immediately. Your work deserves fair compensation." As the morning progressed and the regular school day began, Sarah found herself teaching with a lightness of heart she hadn't felt in years. The students were animated and engaged, clearly pleased by the outcome of the investigation. Even Emma Thornton, whose mother had been so vocal in her opposition, seemed more relaxed and participated more actively in the lessons. During the lunch break, Mary Patterson approached Sarah's desk with a shy smile. "Miss Mitchell, I wanted to ask you something. Would you teach me to write poetry? I've been trying to write some, but I don't know if I'm doing it right." "I would be honored to help you, Mary. Poetry is one of the most beautiful ways to express our thoughts and feelings." "I wrote one about you," Mary said, her cheeks flushing pink, "about how you came to our town and made us believe we could learn anything we set our minds to." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I would very much like to hear it." As the afternoon classes concluded and the students began to file out, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She had found her place in this frontier community, not despite her challenges, but because of how she had chosen to face them. Joseph appeared in the doorway as she was organizing her desk for the next day. "Walk with me?" he asked simply. They strolled through the town as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The snow had stopped, leaving just enough white to make the landscape look clean and fresh. Their footsteps crunched softly on the dusted ground as they walked toward the edge of town. "I have something to tell you," Joseph said as they reached the small hill that overlooked the valley. "I will be leaving Cedar Ridge soon." Sarah's heart clenched with unexpected pain. "Leaving? But why?" "The Indian agent has asked me to help establish a new school on the reservation. There are children there who need education, who need someone who understands what it means to live between two worlds." "Of course," Sarah said, though she felt a profound sadness at the thought of his departure. "They're fortunate to have you." Joseph turned to face her, his dark eyes intense in the fading light. "I want you to know that meeting you has changed something in me. You have shown me that strength and gentleness can exist together, that being different is not something to overcome, but something to embrace." "You've shown me the same thing," Sarah replied softly. "You helped me see that I wasn't broken, just different." "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, "when I return from the reservation, and I will return, I would like to court you properly, if you would be willing." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected this declaration, though she realized now that her feelings for him had been growing steadily since their first meeting. "Joseph, yes, I would be honored." He smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed his entire face. "Then I will work quickly to establish the school so that I can return to you sooner." As they walked back toward town, Sarah felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She had found her purpose as a teacher, her place in the community, and now perhaps her future with a man who understood her in ways she had never thought possible. The next morning brought news that Mrs. Thornton had decided to send Emma to a boarding school in Denver, claiming that Cedar Ridge's educational standards were not suitable for her daughter. Sarah felt sorry for Emma, who would be separated from her friends and familiar surroundings, but she also understood that some people were not ready to accept change. Dr. Morrison stopped by the school that afternoon with a different kind of news. "Miss Mitchell, I wanted you to know that the Territorial Education Board has asked if you would be willing to train other teachers in your methods. They're impressed with your innovative approaches to frontier education." "I would be very interested in that opportunity," Sarah replied, excitement building at the thought of helping other educators. As winter settled over Cedar Ridge, Sarah found herself fully integrated into the community. She taught her students with passion and creativity, helped establish a small library in the church basement, and even began giving evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading and writing skills. Joseph's letters arrived regularly, filled with news of his work on the reservation and his plans for their future. He wrote of the children he was teaching, of the challenges and triumphs of building a new educational program, and of his growing love for her. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. Sarah stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching her students play in the yard, their laughter ringing across the valley. She thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had limped into Cedar Ridge nearly a year ago, and she could hardly believe the transformation that had taken place. She had come seeking refuge and found a home. She had come broken and discovered she was whole. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength came not from being perfect, but from embracing one's imperfections and using them to connect with others. As she prepared to lock up the school for the day, Sarah smiled at the thought of Joseph's promised return. Together, they would continue to build a life based on understanding, acceptance, and the quiet strength that came from choosing love over fear. The woman who had once been called broken had found her place in the world, and in doing so, had helped others find theirs as well.